Right. The paradoxes of self and world in Eliot's poetry. So T.S. Eliot was a creature of paradoxes, and paradoxes which he did his best to cultivate and sustain. He wrote a jumpy, fragmented poetry about terrifying isolation while insisting he was keeping with the oldest traditions of civilization over there. The wasteland has become or has come to be seen as the poem of the 20th century, and yet Eliot was profoundly unhappy with that century and distrusted his contemporaries' reasons for thinking they understood him. He was the American who thought the English were so very different from ourselves in 1917, while at the same time positioning himself as the guardian of the truest English literature. He deplored using poetic learning for the more pretentious modes of publicity, and yet worked night and day to write the literary journalism and cultivate the contacts which would make him the authority in mid century English letters. Part of his campaign involved attacking other poets for insincerity and rhetoric. Immediately after he had written a PhD thesis which argues that there is absolutely no fixed boundary between the inner life and social experience, and that the self is a construction, he criticized many rival poets for not being individual enough, and then advised them to surrender to tradition. He felt good poetry would have only a small but discerning public, and that it depended on popular culture to survive. And these various judgments are each delivered with complete assurance and more than criticism of his opponents. So this Mandarin conviction and his own generation's willingness to be impressed by it would give younger critics ample reasons to want to pull Eliot off his pedestal, and they have been helped by new information about his wretched first marriage, new searchlights turned on his anti-Semitic and misogynistic writing, and revealing detective work about the far right politics of his associates. Now that Eliot's reputation is not what it was, the more sympathetic critics have turned back to these paradoxes as evidence of Eliot's relentless self-irony, undercutting all that he appears to say most dogmatically, or they have seen his capacity to argue on either side of the case as a ruthlessly pragmatic way to outflank his opponents. Eliot's paradoxes certainly have these useful effects, allowing him to sound like he has anticipated all possible positions without being restricted by any of them. But part of Eliot's distinctiveness comes from the way he really believes in those paradoxes. His criticism works tremendously hard to insist that opposites really are related, that self and world really are two sides of the same coin, that the individual and the tradition, or the elite and the popular, are mutually interdependent, and the emotions around the separation and fusion of irreconcilable point of view are a single signal feature of the poetry itself. Opposition is true friendship, remarked Blake, a poet whose influence is stronger in Eliot's oeuvre than Eliot's criticism would lead you to suspect, and it's a motto for the fencing match between you and I, maintained by Eliot's most famous early success, J. Alfred Prufrock. Let us go, then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient ether eyes upon the table. Since we never learn anything more about the you here, most people think you and I are two aspects of Prufrock himself, and that the poem is about a pathological self-consciousness in which the I is constantly seeing itself as you, like a vain TV actor wondering if the cameras are catching him in the best light. The idea is supported by a passage from Eliot's PhD thesis written a few years later, in which he describes how there is an unbridgeable gulf between the way we know the world by practical experience and the way theoretical, objective philosophy knows it, because both ways make the world a construction. We can never, and that's him here, he's being quoted here, we can never, wholly explain the practical world from a theoretical point of view, because this world is what it is by reason of the practical point of view, and the world which we try to explain theoretically is a world spread out upon a table, simply there. The engaged eye perspective can never share the same world as the eye described from the outside as you or he. The philosophical split between an internal and external knowing, which must on some other unattainable level be part of the same thing, becomes, in Prufrock's case, a spiraling of perspectives, from the self he feels to the self known to others upon the table, to the self which knows and fears what others think when they see him, to the self which is then aware of its falsifying those original feelings by being so self-conscious about them, to a self which despairs of its own divorce from itself, and so forth. Prufrock is the Aegean would-be dandy, a remnant of the type noted by Baudelaire and cultivated by Laforgue in the 19th century, who mentally live and sleep before the mirror. Possessed by the need to make himself an original, the dandy's self-appointed mission was to revolt against the soulless democratic homogeneity of the masses through faultless self-position in manners and an expensively minimalist absolute simplicity of dress. My necktie rich and modest, but asserted by a simple pin supplies the perfect touch of menswear narcissism. Eliot was first attracted to the dandy ethos of individualism when he came across Arthur Symons' description of Baudelaire and Laforgue's own verse as a revolt against exteriority, against rhetoric, against a materialistic tradition. And like him, Prufrock loathes the eyes that fix you in a formulated phrase and pin him wriggling on the wall for all to see. This desire to stay unfixed is, however, also what keeps Prufrock from ever declaring himself as the dandy's need to be original requires a constant evasion of others' expectations. As the rhythm is constantly withdrawing from a pattern and then approximating it, Eliot's definition of free verse, so the poem moves with the constant push and pull of Prufrock's own desires to speak out and his fear that if he does so, he will be misunderstood by other people's formula. That anguish is then increased by the thought that he is avoiding the issue by not speaking, immediately followed by bitter cultivation of such despair as aesthetic compensation for this failure to act. After the long 6 and 7 stress lines about what they will say of his dress, for instance, the verse is suddenly brought up short with a theatrical pause. Do I dare disturb the universe? The dramatic silence after dare conveys both the decision's awful potential and a certain flamboyance, and the illustration round it makes it clear that Prufrock is rhetorically admiring himself for the gesture, while at the same time crushingly aware of its cosmotic ridiculousness, as if he or as if the universe could ever be disturbed by himself. In a minute there is time sounds as though it might be hopeful. There is always time to decide. But the same thought immediately becomes way of putting it off, and the verse flow back into the comfortingly hopeless sing-song of decisions and revisions which a minute will reverse. This convoluted mixture of self-inflation, self-deprecation, and self-inflation through self-deprecation is Prufrock's masochistic, hysterical hallmark. He oscillates between the desire to be an individual I, the despair and knowledge that he is always for others a general you or he, a fear that such knowledge has already to generalize his own feelings, and a certain consoling superiority at such self-awareness. All four are present in the casually absurd rhymes murder and create with plate, crisis with ices, me with tea, and in the lurking vanity behind the protestations of his own unimportance. But though I have wept and fasted, wept and prayed, though I have seen my head grown slightly bald, brought in upon the platter, I'm no prophet, and here's no great matter. John the Baptist and later Lazarus and Prince Hamlet are all figures whose suffering reveals the empty values of the worldly powers that oppose them. Like Harold Device, Claudius, denying that he ever could be such a lonely hero, however, ironically suggests how much Prufrock had hoped to be one, weeping and fasting in order to see himself become a prophet. Wept and fasted sends Prufrock's vanity up by comparison with King David's mourning for his enemy Saul. But the same self-mockery is a way to admire himself as a martyr to honesty by doing the mocking. No, I'm not a Prince Hamlet's ghost, a phrase from Waters' Pater's Appreciations. No, Shakespeare's kings are not, nor are meant to be great men, as if Prufrock has all along been modelling himself or his humble failure on great literature. And since Eliot thought Pater was appreciating his own sensitivity, rather more than the subject he wrote about, the hint is that Prufrock's own climb downs are yet another self-absorbed pose. At times, almost the fool concludes the passage mournfully, but recuperating its sense of self-importance by being perfectly aware of the fact that the fool is still the one who speaks the truth to kings. This continual reframing of each feeling as opposed presents a problem for the reader of the poem. At what stage does Prufrock stop knowing himself? Are these literary illusions a humiliating giveaway, or are they themselves self-protectively knowing usages of famous poems to deflect criticism of Prufrock's own desires? When Prufrock says, I have heard the mermaid singing, he is alluding to Don's song, Go and Catch a Falling Star, whose list of impossibilities includes hearing mermaids sing and culminates in the impossibility of finding a faithful woman. Is the illusion a coded way of saying that he has found such a woman, although no one is interested in him, and that he recognizes his own desires in Don's lyric, or a way to safely distance himself from those desires by glancing them off Don's song? The trouble is that every statement in a poem can be taken as an expression of internal feeling, a dramatically ironic reflection on that feeling, as if from outside it, a disclosure of the complex internality which stages such self-divided reflections. a suspicion that this complex internality is itself a defensive move and ever onwards. I should have been a pair of ragged claws, says Prof, and the wish reveals an unexpected similarity between these continual representations of feelings and the exoskeletal structure of the crab, whose insides are on the outside, and who lives by scavenging from the dead. Indeed, the reader's alternation between sympathy and judgment for Prufrock, a sad old woman, sad old man, rather superior self-victimizer, is stuck in the same gap between external and internal perspectives which Prufrock is in. We know what he feels, but then we realize that this might be a pose, which we then feel clever for spotting, but then realize that on the same logic we are posing to ourselves as superior, as we are posing to ourselves as superior beings, and the cycle goes on. External and internal must both be true, but neither can account for the other. And more than one reader has exclaimed, one trying to explain her intuition of Prufrock's tangle of feelings. It is impossible to say that just what I mean, and found her own response already in the poem itself. These sudden unstable reversals between intimacy and distance, between you and I, and reader and poem, have their social counterpart in the trapped, claustrophobic atmosphere of the early poems. When Prufrock notes how the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo, like, and the suggests actually the bored isolation of one who has known them all already, the room, the women, and yet focuses, hypnotized, on evocative but inexplicable details. Michelangelo, and later man in shirt sleeves or arms that are braceleted and white and bare. Like close cropped snapshot, the details gain a mysterious power by cutting off their owners and settings, while the social paraphernalia, the novels, the teacups, seem to be all that persists of the vaporous humans who read them and or drink from them. But the rapid switch between the unexplained and the over familiar has the effect of eliminating the normal word of choice and action between them, which gives Eliot's early poems their feel of life happening automatically and helplessly. In the city of preludes, for instance, people don't go to work or smoke pipe. Their bodies do it for them disconnectedly, with trampling feet and short square fingers stuffing pipes. It's the evening which settles down, the morning that comes to consciousness, and the night that reveals, as if the people settling awake or waking were sleepwalking, acting their parts set out for them by the day's progress. However isolated it wants to be from this uncanny puppet-like world, a vision of the street, and the street hardly understands. The only perspective consciousness of the speaker is, like Prufrock, unable to act or influence it. The soul which projects itself outside the confines of the body appears to be in opposition of the soulless bodies of the city. But when it becomes a part of the evening stretched tight across skies, you are always kept waiting for the action to arrive. Stretched sounds like the main verb, but it is contradicted by or tramped or trampled by insistent feet, suggesting that both are adjectival subclauses, the so stretched tight, which precede another verb after the colon. But the short square fingers, and even in newspapers, have none, as if the soul were always powerless to act. And the outside world's repetition is echoed by the repetition of the speaker's own words. The newspapers, from vacant lots and evening newspapers, Curled hair papers and curled fancies, yellow feet and muddy feet, and so on. Like the city's furnished rooms, the vacant lots, the same words have different intentions inhabiting them temporarily, as if the speaker were feeling his own words to be only borrowed too.